Welcome to this conversation on how to design packaging that fits purpose and is sustainable all at the same time. My name is Anu Partanen and I will be moderating this discussion today. This is the 5th discussion in this Think Circle series. Our topic today is to examine how creating more sustainable food systems with more sustainable packaging can help us reach more low-carbon future. This topic is extremely important, especially as our world leaders are convening in Glasgow, Scotland, for the United Nations Climate Change Conference, COP26, as we speak. What is this Think Circle? Think Circle is a platform where we can tackle the issues that we face in pursuit of low-carbon circularity and more sustainable food systems with more sustainable packaging. It is clear that no one organization can do this alone, and no one company can do this alone. Huhtamaki is a global provider of sustainable packaging solutions, and it created this Think Circle series so that we can all come together to discuss common practices and common understanding. We cannot solve the issues of more sustainable food systems unless the whole value chain works together. Setting ambitious goals is one thing. Setting the right incentives and finding the right tools to reach those goals is another. Today we are going to have a truly global discussion. 3 of our panelists are joining us from Michigan State University and its famous School of Packaging, with a live audience present. One of our panelists is joining us from Washington, D.C., another from Italy, Rome. I myself am standing here in the Nordics, currently in Tallinn, Estonia. And of course, our audience online is from everywhere and anywhere in the world. Welcome everyone to this event. First, a few words to the audience. You can join the conversation during this event by writing comments and questions in the Q&A box that you see on the right-hand side of this video stream window. Those of you in the live audience, you can join the event on your mobile phone or other device at worksup.com/thinkcircle and type in your questions and comments there. I will then magically see your questions and comments here, and I can bring them to our panelists, as many as I can during the event. For our panelists, we would really love this to be a genuine conversation, so if you would like to ask for a turn to speak or comment on what somebody else said, please just raise your hand and I will see you on the screen and I can then give you a turn to speak. In social media, you can use the hashtag ThinkCircle. Now let me introduce our panelists. Let me start with Professor Matthew Daum, Director, School of Packaging, Michigan State University, present live on stage at Michigan State University. Welcome, Matthew. Welcome, Matthew.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Matthew, what do you think are the biggest challenges we face right now in creating more sustainable packaging and more sustainable food systems?
Well, I think one of the biggest challenges right now is just the environment that we're in. There's a tension, I think, between some views that are negative towards packaging versus the benefits of packaging. And that in that environment, sometimes it's hard to have the right conversations to move things forward. You have brand owners making big proclamations, and rightly so, about changes that they want to make. And yet, at the same time, it takes time for innovation, and you need to maintain things like food safety, food protection, reducing food waste. So you have all of these counterbalancing factors at one time. And so it creates a challenging environment, I think, to really make rapid progress.
And where do you think the biggest opportunities lie?
You know, I'm actually optimistic. From where I sit at the university, I see a couple of trends that I think really are going to play out well over the next few years. One is just in new material development. I think there's a lot of innovation that's going on that is going to help in recycling efforts. and still maintain all the benefits of packaging. I see a lot of new cooperation and discussion amongst different parties in the whole value chain, trying to work out all the different incentives that need to be in place for recycling ecosystems. And I'm also optimistic about some of the technologies for reclaiming materials at end of life, chemical recycling, mechanical recycling, that kind of thing. So I think there's a lot of optimism that we can have on all three of those fronts.
Thank you, Matthew. Let's now move to Washington, D.C., where we have Natha Dempsey, President, Foodservice Packaging Institute. Welcome, Natha.
Good morning.
Natha, from your perspective, what do you think are the biggest challenges in food packaging right now?
Well, being in food service, we only have one small piece of the food packaging puzzle. I often look at, packaging as a whole, and it's hard to come up with just one challenge. I think, to reiterate some of what Matthew is speaking about or just spoke about, it's miscommunication or misinformation that's out there about packaging. It's fitting into a piece of the recycling and composting and recovery puzzle with something that is, for food service, a very small piece of the waste stream, but tempering consumer experiences. We all touch food service packaging every day, and we have a very emotional reaction to it, and understanding where that fits into the whole and the packaging conundrum. Things like performance and the challenges of getting folks to understand that packaging is here to serve a purpose, and it has to do with the performance of the product that's inside the packaging. So it's a very whole conundrum right now. There are so many things going on around packaging and different challenges, and the conversation is very, very large.
And that is, of course, what we're here to talk about today. So, Natha, it is a large conversation, and we're going to continue with it. But what are some of the opportunities that you see?
Oh, there are so many. I think in our current climate, the conversation around packaging and the understanding around packaging is growing from general consumers down through supply chain. I think we have huge opportunities to bring together and collaborate different pieces of the supply chain, and that is from material starts and designs all the way down through end of life and reclamation and recircling our materials.
Thank you, Natha. Let's go back to Michigan State University and meet David Feber, partner packaging service line McKinsey and Company. Welcome, David.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today.
And so, David, the same questions to you. What do you think is the biggest challenge in our pursuit for more sustainable packaging today?
I think the biggest challenge is figuring out what we mean when we say sustainable packaging and what we're trying to solve for. I mean, if we just step back and think about what's on the world's mind in terms of sustainability, there's really three things in terms of concerns. Number one is circularity, and that we're going to run out of the world's resources if we don't stop this linear way of working. And so we have to design products to be more recyclable and have more recycled content. The second has been that in many parts of the world, we have issues with waste and plastic waste, and that we need to come up with a way to control that and keep it out of nature and out of uncontrolled landfills and water systems. And the third has been that we're producing too many carbon CO2 gases for global warming, and we need to decarbonize. And when you step back and look at packaging, no one packaging solution is good at all three of those. And so it comes down to specifically what product segment and where you are in the world to solve that need. And today there's often a lot of confusion about picking the right solution for the right application.
And what do you think are the biggest opportunities that we have?
I think the biggest opportunity is cracking that. I mean, there's a lot of innovation going on across the industry to come up with products that are recyclable that were never recyclable before and still maintain the performance so that we can have the same shelf life and extension of products, and coming up with alternative uses of new materials.
Thank you, David. Now I'm happy to present to you today Ann OHara, President, Huhtamaki, North America. Welcome, Ann.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
And what do you think are the biggest challenges when it comes to creating a sustainable food system and especially sustainable fit-for-purpose packaging in the United States?
Well, I think in the United States we have the advantage of pretty sustainable food system supply chain, but we do have a lot of food waste, similar to other places in the world. And so I think that when we think about packaging, it's similar to what our other panelists were talking about, scoping out the challenge to not just be the packaging, which of course it is, the renewability, the carbon footprint of making the packaging, and the recyclability, but really zooming out to how does it service the whole supply chain? What is the impact of packaging on water scarcity? What is the impact of packaging on the food waste? What is the impact on the end of life of the products that it's holding? And it's very difficult to make that a simple message. It's very difficult to make that an intuitive choice for our customers and for our consumers. But I think it's the challenge we need to take on, which is, expand the scoreboard to be about the whole supply chain, not just the packaging, while not losing sight of our responsibility to use renewable resources and find end-of-life solutions. And that's a big challenge, is to really help people see that in a simple way and in a way that they're making smart choices.
And so where do you see the biggest opportunities in the United States?
Well, I think the biggest opportunities are in collaboration. I think we have again, a very robust supply chain in general. Not at this moment in time. There's a lot of supply chain constraints at the moment because of various different factors with the pandemic. But in general, the United States has a pretty mature economy and a robust supply chain. So there's an enormous opportunity to collaborate across different types of companies, across universities and companies, third parties. We just have so much smarts here that I think that in general also I see the packaging evolution being much more business-driven and institution-driven than regulatory-driven. Not that there isn't a place for regulation, and there is, and it's very helpful in terms of drawing the boundaries. But in terms of innovation and driving innovation to the newest packaging and also using digital solutions, I see a great opportunity for collaboration across businesses. And here in the US, it's very exciting to be part of that.
Thank you, Anne. And finally, we go to Rome, Italy, and meet Dr. Rosa Roll, Senior Officer, UN Food and Agriculture Organization. Welcome, Rosa.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Rosa, you come to this conversation from a little bit different background. You work in the developing countries and you work specifically to eliminate food waste and create sustainable packaging in those conditions. What do you think are the biggest challenges in your perspective?
In terms of the work that we do in a development context, cost is a major issue where packaging is concerned. And so to a large extent, what we have to do when we work with countries is to find solutions that are cost effective and that also generate opportunities for the clients that we serve. Because it's the way in which we work, it's not only about supplying food to a market where you have different levels of people. To a large extent, much of the populations that we serve are people who spend a majority of their incomes on food. And therefore, whatever we do, we have to find solutions that continue to make that food affordable. And so in that context, to a large extent, the problems that we see in the developing countries now is with the problems of the accumulation of plastics and plastic waste is a direct result of the fact that a lot of the plastics, single-use plastics, are very inexpensive. And therefore, we have to find solutions that work in sustainable solutions that are really easily workable in terms of reducing food loss and food waste in the supply chain systems.
And Rosa, where do you think the biggest opportunities are?
To a large extent, what we've been doing in terms of supporting countries to move to more sustainable systems, we've been introducing, and very, very successfully so, the use of reusable types of packaging in the supply chains. And we have seen some really fantastic results where the reduction of food waste is concerned. For example, where we are able to reduce the levels of food waste significantly, and while also increasing returns for smallholders, it helps also to reduce the cost of food as well because of the reduction that is you realize in the supply chain, and as well generates additional employment streams and provides the opportunity to diversify markets for the smallholders because they are able to produce and ship better quality fresh produce. So I think this one's a real big winner. Another area that we see with very good potential opportunity emerging is the issue specific to pertinent to edible packaging films that would really make a difference in terms of the problems that we now see with the accumulation and the issues of the single-use plastics. And one of the opportunities we see emerging is that there's quite many of the substrates that are used in the production of edible food packaging are also very readily accessible and available in many of these countries.
Thank you, Rosa. So we are all here now. Let's move to the roundtable discussion. So to begin, we've now talked about that the problem is complex, there's different issues. We talk about fit for purpose packaging. So packaging that is designed for a specific purpose, obviously, whatever that may be. And at the same time, we talk about making that packaging more sustainable. Matthew, what does this terminology mean? How do you think we should think about these issues when we start a conversation like this, which now many of you already have said that it is very complex? How do we make sense of all of it?
Well, I think first of all, you have to acknowledge it is complex. And so, David talked earlier about we have to define what do we mean by sustainable. And so, at least from the School of Packaging's perspective, we try to teach from a material neutral point of view, and we try to look across the whole value chain. And in some ways that's complicated, but in other ways it gets you to think holistically. And so I would go back and try to reemphasize that it's about picking the right material for the right application and looking at the overall benefit that comes out of choosing that application. So Rosa talked about edible films, for example. That can be a wonderful choice in situations where you may not have a reclamation system in place, for example. You may have a reuse situation for a product that lends itself to that. But you may have a more traditional film-based solution that extends shelf life, for example, or really reduces your food waste. And so you have to look at that whole equation when you start thinking about this idea of sustainability and what really is the least amount of drain on natural resources.
And Anne, this often seems to almost become a war between materials. Is wood-based best or plastics if they are recycled and so on? What do you think is the significance of material choices in sustainable packaging?
I think it's a significant step forward for people to be not only material neutral. I like that term. We actually, at the same time, are very similar, call it material positive. Neutral or positive, about the same. Is the thinking around being choiceful of what the application needs, what geography you're in, what does the resources look like, and what does the reclamation look like. You see this in choices of substrates. So you see people in some regions being less attracted towards plastics. That generally not true in North America, where there is a robust plastics industry. There's a robust effort to create recycle streams and reuse of those resins back in packaging, if not in other applications. And so sometimes the substrate choice and this tension between what people consider good or bad in terms of sustainability can be quite regional. Fiber is also a wonderful solution. We, as a company, have a very large fiber portfolio in addition to our plastics portfolio. And the fiber portfolio is very sustainable in its choice of materials, renewable resources in the paper and the fiber that we use. But likewise, it needs an end-of-life story. So I think that when I think about the different substrates, I tend to think similar to David's 3 areas. I do it a little more chronologically. Is it a renewable material? Did it take a lot of energy and water to make it? And then what do we do at the end of life? And if you look at fiber, great beginning of life story, we're working on the end of life solutions. If you think about plastics, it's not always the best beginning of life solution, but typically a very good end of life solution. And you have to really take all those things into consideration, think about the product, think about the region, and that'll help you make your choice. I think you also need to understand, and everyone's part of this community in the whole food system and in packaging, that things are going to change. And to be prepared for the next 5 to 10 years to invest in the future and be prepared with these new solutions. So what is good today may change because of the ability to recycle more plastics or in the ability to claim and separate more of the fiber solutions in the supply chain. So I think that it's understanding those 3 elements, and then it's picking for the right product and application, and then it's being prepared to change and invest in some new innovations as they become available.
And David, you talked about the different purposes that we have. Are we thinking of climate and becoming carbon neutral? Are we thinking of resources? Are we thinking of plastic waste? How would you prioritize those? What should be the most important goal?
I think the answer comes down to where you are in the world and what access to infrastructure you have and what the local challenges are of the area. I mean, just to use a couple examples, we've seen, we just saw in the United States, one of the large quick service food chains announced that they were switching from paper to plastic cups because of the paper cups where they were didn't have access to a recycling infrastructure, but the plastic ones did. In other parts of the world, that would never fly, where there's bigger concerns about plastic waste and desire to use more fiber, and maybe in areas where fiber can be sourced with a carbon neutral or a much lower carbon footprint. The other one we see a lot is we'll see a strong intent from a consumer side, like compostable materials being used in packaging. But often those can be used in areas that don't have access to industrial composting, at least in the United States and many parts of the area. There's a lot used where it doesn't have the full closed loop yet.
I have a few audience questions here. One of them is, I will immediately direct one to you. Thank you to the audience for sending in questions. And the question is, how might different nodes of the food service packaging supply chain work together to enable more circularity? Rosa, how does all these conversations sound to you, like looking at it from your perspective?
Okay, looking at it from a development perspective, I think some of the issues that are very critical when working with countries to come up with sustainable solutions, it's always a bottom line is cost. And then, of course, we have to work with them to make sure that whatever that is introduced to them is available, accessible. This is where sometimes partnerships have to come in terms of helping to make the packaging available within countries through setting up in the packaging industries. That's one thing that usually can be done. And if a new innovation, for example, when we started doing a lot more work in the countries with things like the plastic crates, what happened is we saw actually businesses beginning to be developed that would supply the requirements. It's not always the case for all the different types of packaging solutions that can make a difference in terms of sustainability. So again, availability, accessibility, and cost are some of the critical issues that we are always confronted with working in many of the contexts in which we work.
Okay, let's see if we have Natha back and if I can hear you as well, Natha. Could you hear the question before? I can repeat it. So it was how
Please
might
do. It broke up. Yeah.
I hear you now. Yeah. So how might different nodes of the food service packaging supply chain work together to enable more circularity?
I think I talk regularly, speak regularly with folks throughout the supply chain. I think that it is very helpful what we're seeing now, where converters of material, it used to be a direct line between converters and operators. So those restaurant groups would speak to the person who's manufacturing the cups and containers for them. But now we're seeing a dialogue that goes further throughout this chain. Operators are not hesitating to talk to material suppliers. They're talking to the folks that are creating those materials. And likewise, material suppliers are talking downstream to material recovery facilities, composting facilities. And we're seeing this sort of conversation stretch throughout the supply chain. Often when I speak with operators, those folks that are looking to create, how do I create a national packaging strategy? Well, what are you looking to accomplish? What is most important for you as a company, and what is most important for your customers to engage around what matters most to them? And that's going to vary. In addition to sustainability being customizable and regional, it's also going to be customizable and regional for those brands. And so then that dialogue becomes about what they most need and ripples out into the pool of converters, suppliers, reclaimers, and in order to gather up all the pieces.
So one really interesting and in many ways tricky question is how different regions, in different geographical regions, you have different needs, of course, as Rosa has discussed here, but you have different perceptions among consumers, among decision makers on what is sustainable, what is not. Matthew, how would you characterize differences between American and European views on what kinds of solutions or materials are considered sustainable in packaging?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I can think of a couple things. Fiber, I think, definitely is more favored right now in Europe for a variety of different reasons. You have maybe not the most robust, but at least you have some infrastructure in North America for plastics. And so you do see more plastic use. It hasn't totally fallen out of favor in North America. I think there's also, if you think about the hierarchy of packaging, and typically you would say, there's reuse, there's recycle, there's reduce. And I think in Europe, there's all the way to the top of the pyramid is usually the thinking, let's try to reuse. And I think in North America, you still have a lot of conversation around recycle and reduction of material. I think there's also a little bit more of an appetite in Europe for incineration and energy capture as a way of recycling. So you're reclaiming the energy from your packaging. I don't really see that happening at all in North America. So those are a few examples.
David, what do you think of these differences between European and American perceptions, or indeed differences between how, for example, scientists might view some different solutions and consumers might view them?
Yeah, so we have a couple data points. We just completed a 10,000 consumer data point survey on consumer sentiment related to packaging sustainability across 10 different countries of the world. And there were definitely differences between the countries. Of interest was when you ask consumers what they perceive to be most sustainable, paper and glass tend to score highest. And plastic only scores high in those countries that have a very high recycle rate and recovery rate across the 10 countries we looked at. I think the good news in all of that is consumers are really concerned. And for the first time, we've really hit a tipping point of progress when it comes to packaging sustainability. I think that the challenge is consumers are also very confused. And so we're seeing products come to market that may have the right intent to satisfy a consumer desire to be more sustainable, but may actually be not achieving a better good for the world as a result, whether they've switched from a recyclable to a non-recyclable substrate, or they've come up with a package solution to remove plastic, which has created more food waste or more challenges in the infrastructure. And so I think we're at a stage where the positive momentum is everyone wants to make the world a better place. The challenge is the consumer sentiment hasn't fully caught up with where the science is yet.
So in Europe, for example, in the European Union, this past summer, single-use plastics directive came into force, which means that various kinds of single-use plastics are basically banned and have to be replaced with bamboo or other materials. And Huhtamaki is a global company, and you're working in more than 30 countries. What do these kinds of regional differences, both in consumer perceptions and in regulation, mean for your company?
Well, it's really an advantage for us as a global company to have exposure to all of those different trends. As David was saying, there's some unintended consequences with various different regulations or innovations or choices, but it's all learning. And so being in 30 different countries, having a broad range of substrates in our portfolio, from the fiber and paper, plastics, flexibles, we can really see things happening in different geographies. As an example, before the single-use plastics directive, there was also a discussion around reusable, as Matt was saying. And so we looked into reusables, and it still may be an area of interest, but our early research said the challenge with reusables is it uses almost 3 times as much resources in terms of CO2 emissions because of the energy and the water required to rewash those reusables versus single use. But as David was saying earlier, that still might be the right solution in some places where there isn't necessarily water scarcity or energy isn't as expensive because perhaps they don't have as good collection for the single use. So I think your question around what does it mean for us as a global company? It means that we get to be exposed to all these trends, which are appropriate in the different countries, and we get to respond to those and learn with the trend and then to use those learnings around the world. And as David's saying, everyone wants us to be a better world. We all want to have more sustainable packaging that supports a sustainable supply chain. We want to have a lot less food waste. Today, across the world, there's about 1/3 of the food is wasted in supply chain. And so we all want that. And I think that it's almost good news that there's different approaches in the different regions because it allows us to innovate and to get smarter and then eventually to use all those learnings from different countries to help other countries that might not have seen the trend from another region. But it is very interesting to see these different trends and to be the same company, and in fact, sometimes servicing the same customer. A very famous example right now, a very popular example supporting the discussion around the difference between Europe and North America is that a very large customer, and it's very public, it's not confidential, McDonald's has recently switched in North America to a plastic cold cup versus in Europe, they're a very committed paper cup. And that's an appropriate difference. The regional differences have guided them to that difference and that choice. And it allows them to innovate in both geographies and continue to look for the penultimate solution in each of those formats. So how do we get cold cup plastics to use more recycled material? How do we actually build a system with the food service and quick service meals to collect those cups so that they're used in recycling? Likewise, in a paper cup situation, how do you build the supply chain to make that a much more recyclable situation and find the ultimate solution, which is to replace the polyethylene coating with something that's more compostable or not as resin-based. So I think that the regional differences it's a wonderful thing to have that diversity because it forces us to innovate. And I know all packaging companies, the universities, we're all up for the challenge. So I think the regional differences are helpful. And
so, Rosa, how does this look like to you? Should we have some sort of regulation or global ideas on how to arrange all this? Or is it best always to go local from your perspective?
I think it's good to understand the global framework, but when it comes to working with countries, we have to look at what's happening in that context and to identify solutions that are locally available and adoptable. Because when we're always working with stakeholders, and you have to work with something that makes economic sense to them and also is feasible in terms of the replication of the small pilots that we do in terms of getting them acquainted with the developments in terms of the types of packaging options that we can bring to them to enhance sustainability.
Did I see Anne raise a hand? If so, go ahead, Anne. No, I'm imagining things. Okay, so Natha, let's go to you. Here are a few questions from the audience that I think I might direct to you, even though they weren't exactly named. This is about the United States. Can we create a general consensus in the US about how to deal with society municipal solid waste? Is that your line of work?
It is. So at the Foodservice Packaging Institute, we're the trade association for food service packaging manufacturers and that supply chain. So when we talk about food service, we're talking about the easiest, simplest way to think about this. It's the items you get in the bag when you take to-go food home from a restaurant. And we have been working for about a decade on recovering food service packaging items. And, like we are material neutral, we are also method agnostic for that. We want the highest and best use for our packaging, and those packaging products, be them plastics or paper or aluminum. That tends to be our substrate world for now. But in that, we've talked about, is there a one-size-fits-all solution? Should we be looking at a national strategy for recycling? Do we need to beef up at the federal level our recycling and composting world? The answer is yes. But we also have to remember that, again, going back to our, I could echo every theme of every panelist here today. Our world is also very local and very regional, and solutions that work in New York City are probably not going to be the same solutions that we're going to see out in rural Montana. So this conversation around waste and recycling and recovery is also very local, and is going to require different components, because if you're looking at different packaging solutions for different regions, those packaging solutions may require different end-of-life solutions. I think it was David or Matthew who was speaking to incineration and waste to energy recovery. We don't have strong solutions here in the U.S. for that. And we would be looking to other options for that. Composting facilities are located in very specific locations around the country that will actually take packaging products. There aren't very many. So is compostable packaging a solution for all regions? Probably not. Is recycling going to be the answer? And I'm posing these questions hypothetically to sort of illustrate and exemplify the fact that all of our regional solutions are also going to require, regional packaging solutions are going to require end-of-life choices that are customized and regional.
So David, we've talked about a little bit about regulation and whether we would need it or not, but do you see the current regulatory trends in the United States or in the European Union as helpful or harmful? Is it possible for well-meaning regulation to actually make things worse, since, as we've now heard, issue?
Yeah, so first, maybe I'll start with the positive side. We're sitting here in the state of Michigan at Michigan State University, one of the best packaging schools in the world. And in the state of Michigan, there's a bottle deposit on these bottles on PET and aluminum containers. And overall, across the U.S., I'll use that as an example, about 30% of PET gets recovered. But in states where they have a regulation for bottle deposit, like Michigan, it's close to 75%. And so we see real positive impacts with thoughtful regulation. Of course, with any regulation, there's always consequences and sometimes unintended consequences that occur. I think right now in the world, there's a momentum everywhere, especially in the European Union, but in the US in several parts and in many parts of the world, to have some type of sustainability regulation and producer responsibility and tax. And the best policies are those that are really thinking about and incorporating the packaging converters and the users of the materials into the solution to make sure that they're really efficiently solving for closed loop and recovery. And I think we see many regulations that are doing so. I think we see some that are creating a secondary tax for the community or for the municipality that's passing them, which tends to have other challenges. And then the other I guess successful or unsuccessful formula is use the science to guide the policy and think through the unintended consequences. As one of our panelists mentioned before, when there's a single-use plastic ban, and if that causes more food waste, sometimes the carbon footprint from the food can be 10 times as much as from the packaging. And so it's important to think through the full supply chain when policies are being set up.
The European Union is a regulation powerhouse in a sense, and often other countries or regions in the world follow its example. Matthew, do you think that the EU regulations like the single-use plastics ban is going to impact American regulation in the future?
Well, I think it will, just from the point of view that anytime you live as a global citizen and you're in a government, you're going to look around and see what others are doing. So yes. For me, I prefer regulation that incentivizes. I think human nature tends to be creative and tries to avoid the negative in terms of you can't do this, you can't do that. I think there's more creativity, innovation when regulatory bodies create laws and regulations that try to incentivize towards a positive direction, and then let the marketplace be creative to fill the solutions, create the solutions. So in some ways, if you put a hard line in the ground and you say, we're going to ban X, Y, Z, it does act as a forcing function to step back and say, wow, let's think about all the implications here. And you can eventually, over time, move in the right direction. But I think just as a general rule, I would prefer to see regulations more based on incentivizing the proper end goal.
And what do you think? What kind of regulation could help innovation instead of hurt it?
Well, I think we heard David talk about regulation that's oriented towards consumers and positive consumer behavior. So, the bottle tax is one of those things. And there could be other incentives that could be created for consumers that would help continue to educate them, that are not penalties, but more incentives. I also think that innovation could be drawn out from different regulations that would have the ability for people to work more collaboratively together to come up with solutions across the supply chain. I do think that, as Matt was saying, sometimes the bans do create creativity, but I do think that we need science to support it. And so if there are considerations for bans, it needs to be more thoughtful around phasing. There are a number of material changes that we're contemplating within our own business, but thankfully the regulation has been carefully spaced out because, packaging in general is a very high cost, high capital intensive business. So to make a change, you really need the industry to invest over the course of 1 to 3 years to develop the new solution. So I think that as you think about regulations that may be helpful, the ones that give that amount of time for the industry to respond, use the creativity from the incentives more so than from the penalties and the bans, that's the winning solution. And you see people changing towards something and not away from something else.
Natha, there's an audience question that I will again direct to you. Can extended producer responsibility play a role to solve recycling for packaging?
So the Food Service Packaging Institute has its policy positions around producer responsibility. And I think, ultimately, idealistically, yes, absolutely. I think that is the paramount goal, is to get legislation and regulation and these mandates to work in favor of supporting something like infrastructure. But it has to be done carefully, and it has to be done in the vein of education and learning. We haven't had extended producer responsibility here in the United States until the legislation that was passed this year. And I think it's going to be a learning process throughout, both the state of Maine and the state of Oregon's processes to see what producer responsibility looks like in this country. Our organization and our industry is for, good policy, but I hesitate to say that we would be supportive of something that just is looking to create a fee that's pulling from the packaging industry that then lines the coffers of, state or municipal or federal governments. That's not the point. We want to see robust recycling and composting support materials, and robust, when I say robust recycling or robust recovery, it means for things like food service packaging, because often in producer responsibility schemes, manufacturers pay into the system but don't get the opportunity to then reap the benefits from that. They're paying on packaging products, but we want to make sure that that fee is being utilized for the recovery of our products. So I think that's the way. I think I've answered the question. I'm happy to revisit it.
Well, I will continue, Natha, because there's another question that relates to a little bit what you were saying. How is the development of commercial composting and recycling infrastructure, streams, facilities being incentivized?
That's not entirely my world, but I can talk about what I've experienced around recycling and composting and food service packaging. In terms of incentivization, are we talking about for composters? Like, this is a huge piece of our puzzle. Is it incentivization for composters or recyclers to take products like food service packaging? Is it consumers putting it in their bins? Are you getting something back as a consumer for doing that action and taking that action? Is it something else within that cycle or within that system that you're looking to incentivize? I think there are a number of ways that things can be incentivized. For us and the work that we do, what we look for are end markets that want the material, because I think Rosa's hit it hard enough that this is economic in nature, and that if there is no demand for a product and economic pull for that product, it's a lot harder to get it recovered, because it's got to be pulled through the system. We need models that allow for, the creation of business here and the creation of those economics. So for us, it is making sure that, when a material recovery facility, and I'm using recycling as an example because that seems to be the easiest one right now, when a material recovery facility is looking to collect something like food service packaging products, and I could name a number of them, what's their incentive to do that? It's going to be someone who's going to purchase that from them. And that then pulls it through the system. And once a MRF, a material recovery facility, has accepted a product, then it's going to the community and making sure that that gets conveyed to their customers. So that's a little bit of a difference there. Can it be something like a subsidy or something of that nature for a facility? Yes. Idealistically, holistically, we would like it to be something that's a little bit more organic, like the relationship between an end market, a MRF, a community, and then ultimately the consumer.
Thank you, Natha. Rosa, we have a question from the audience. How do we solve the waste management system in the low and lowest economies in the world?
That's a good question, and it's not an easy one because we see in a number of countries that in which we work, governments are imposing bans on plastics, on the use of single-use plastics. However, this is something that is also very difficult to manage, just because of the fact that the single-use plastics are the most accessible in terms of availability in local markets and cost. And yes, indeed, these systems, the legislation is there, but actually getting it enforced without the appropriate alternative solutions is a major issue. And this is where that's why I say this is a difficult problem to tackle. However, I think over time and with consumer education, there's a lot of consumer education that is required, and education of stakeholders in the supply chain. I think that, and of course, with some of the, as we say, the incentives that are required to make the changes that are needed, I think over time, there is the possibility. It may be a slow process, but I think there is that level of awareness now, and I think the momentum now is correct. It's the right time to get things moving along in that direction, and I think gradually we will begin to see some of these changes.
So let's move to the last theme of our conversation. Let's look forward into the future and innovation. And we have a question from the audience that I think we'll just do a round. All you panelists can answer. What are some new packaging innovations you are all excited about? Let's start with David.
I mean, there are so many. I think we're seeing an unprecedented level of investment and innovation to solve some of these challenges of recyclability, of food waste. I mean, a couple that come to mind. One has been using digital to help address some of the food waste issues. There's a company recently that we've seen that has come up with a digital rewritable label that goes on a food product. And so think of a fresh food product, and as it reaches its expiry or spoilage date, it dynamically adjusts the price down to move the product to consumers that are going to consume it faster. So it's a end-to-end technology designed to decrease food waste, and then therefore has also economic benefits to create an incentive of use. The other category that's been the most intriguing has been the amount of material research to come up with materials that can be recycled and still meet the performance and cost requirements of the package.
Matthew.
Yeah, let me pick up on David's comment on materials, because some of that research is happening right here, right next door at the School of Packaging. I'll give you two examples. So one is some advancement in coatings for paper to make them plastic-like in their performance. And I think it's very promising research, and would not be surprised in a number of years where we have some compostable, recyclable paper products that perform like some of today's plastics. Another area in the plastics space, using nanotechnology and safe, inert, very minute, small amounts of material embedded in let's say, mono-layer plastics that create the performance of a multi-layer material. And so in doing that, now you're talking about huge extension in shelf life and being able to be recyclable in current systems. So those are just two examples of the type of research that we're doing here at Michigan State that I think in a few years, hopefully, is scalable and makes a big difference.
Anne, what do you think?
Yeah, I'll triple vote for the material science. I think that there's so much work being done on the coatings, the chemistries, just the ability to use different substrates in combination, but still have it be a monomaterial or monomaterial-like in the waste stream. It's huge. If I think across my portfolio, in my business, I have retail business sold through the stores, a food service, and consumer. In every area, we have some major projects going on with regards to the chemistry or the substrate to make it a more sustainable product in the whole supply chain. And that's incredibly exciting, working together with universities, with suppliers, and with our customers to trial new products. And that's super exciting. I think that's one. And then the second thing I would say is digital. I think that we're going to see a great awakening of how do we use digital in a very cost-effective way to help us track and separate waste so that it's more intuitive to customers how they use the packaging and that it ends up in the right spot. And I do hope that this digital solution and innovation becomes very cost-effective, because I think that that could also help in the developing world, where Rosa's been very articulate about the needs for a cost-effective approach. And again, digital tools nowadays are incredibly cost-effective, very seamless, and there's a lot of creativity around the use. And so I think the digital revolution is really going to help packaging become more sustainable.
Rosa, what do you think? What are the packaging solutions you are excited about?
Well, I'm very excited about the potential for the use of edible packaging as a solution in developing countries. But I also agree with the last speaker that the whole issue of the digitalization can make a big difference in terms of the accessibility and the use of packaging. And we saw quite a lot of that happening already during the COVID-19 pandemic in a number of developing countries, where you saw shifts in terms of the types of packaging that are used toward helping to facilitate access of people to food, fresh food, during times when there were a number of problems. And I think the digital solutions as they are now are simple enough, but they offer so much potential that by putting together different combinations of solutions together, I think there's a lot that can be actually accomplished in terms of innovations that bring the different dimensions together to work effectively for reducing, in particular, food loss and waste. Thank you.
And Natha, what do you think? What are you excited about?
Oh, well, so I sit at the bottom of the chain here, from, Michigan State's packaging school to Huhtamaki and Ann's company, down into this space where our industry is constantly innovating. We see constant research and development going on around packaging solutions, and many of them are very exciting. In food service right now, as many of you are probably aware, our world is shifting from a situation in which you were getting a tray of something over a counter and it was a 30-second interaction and you were done with your meal in 2 to 3 minutes, to a product that has to travel in an automobile or a drone or a robot to get to you, and it's 28 to 32 minutes later, and you're using an app on your phone to check where that is the robot at the right temperature. We're seeing a lot in the veins of tamper evident and requirements around tamper-proof, tamper evident, so that you as a customer are assured that your food is safe. But also around everything that the panelists have just spoken about. Materials are switching, coatings are switching. I can't wait to see more of what digital does. I happen to actually be at a conference right now where this is entirely about the delivery space and just the technology that goes along with it, and what everyone is going to be able to do through something as simple as a phone. It's pretty remarkable. And I'm excited. If I look back and I think about the packaging that we've seen, something like molded fiber started out looking like a drink carrier. Everything looked like a drink carrier. It was kind of a gray, pulpy thing. The amazing things that you can do with molded fiber now, from substrate to packaging that behaves differently. I think Matthew mentioned the fact that, things that are fiber that do and act like plastics. We've seen that for the last couple of years, where paper is taking on and mimicking the abilities of plastics, like a snap closure that you can hear audibly. Very, very interesting and unique. And I get a little passionate about packaging because I think it's just so innovative and so cool. I guess that's the word that I would use. So I'm excited about a lot of things, and I can't wait to see what this industry is going to do.
Thank you, Natha. Perfect closing words. Thank you to all our panelists. We can still continue the discussion with the hashtag ThinkCircle on social media, and you can find additional interviews with all our panelists online if you go to think-circle.com, and you can also subscribe to a newsletter there. A very warm thank you to our panelists. Very warm thank you to all our audience members, whether in Michigan or online, and thank you for all your questions. This was really fantastic. Have a wonderful day, and please stay tuned for our next ThinkCircle event.